Welcome to the MAG Network podcast.
Today, given its 50th anniversary of MAG, we thought we'd do an interview with the president, member number 3, the man who was there on day one, Ian Mutch.
Is it really 50 years?
It is, indeed, or very close to it. I don't know not exactly which day of the week or which month it was that you actually constituted MAG.
Yeah, but it's no good asking me, you know.
You were only there.
Yeah, I think it was July, because the helmet law came out in June the 1st, 1973. And I was home on leave from the Merchant Navy, and I thought, this just can't happen. This is just, to have your world almost destroyed, certainly very severely impaired by government interference, is something which probably takes a lot of explaining to people today, to riders today. You just can't get the hang of it, because if you've grown up with the law, you never really see it as quite the imposition that it is, and certainly was to us at the time. It's almost as if somebody were to say, well, we're going to abolish motorcycles, or you must all have outrigger wheels on them. Nobody can ride something so insanely dangerous as a two-wheeled vehicle. Mm-hmm. And many people have speculated since, golly, you know, if we'd had the sort of governments and the sense about safety and welfare that we have today in our culture, and you'd come up with the proposition of a vehicle with two wheels that you would lean to go around corners, and you'd be out in the elements of rain and wind and everything else, you'd never have got a license to put it on the road. It would never have been authorised. 73, it was only 4 years after Easy Rider came out, and the image that captured my imagination as a very young biker, I had a bike then, I had had a bike since 69. 69 is when Easy Rider was released. And the vision of Peter Fonda and Dennis Hopper riding across the western United.States with the wind blowing through their hair was just so iconic. That's what I want to be. And then somebody comes along and says, oh no, you've got to wear a helmet on all occasions. And I did used to wear one, I would think 70% of the time probably. But the idea that you would be forced to do it was just absolutely difficult to digest. And you had to really have been born into that era to understand how difficult it was to accept that. So we didn't accept that.
Do you think that, as you say, there were a large percentage of riders that were already wearing crash helmets at the time?
Yeah.
Do you think it's something that was introduced that basically was just accepted because the vast majority were wearing crash helmets? How was it perceived? I think a lot of people these days get the impression that MAG is anti-crash helmet.
Yeah.
But that wasn't really the case, was it?
Not at all. About 90% of riders were voluntarily wearing helmets all the time by the time the law came in. And what the law reflects in part is the recognition that when everybody, or the vast majority, are doing something which you feel that they should, and which most people in this country would accept they should, then it becomes much more viable to enforce it, because you're only telling people to do something they're already doing. And there are diehards like us that would want to go out on a nice hot sunny day and think, oh, I don't think I'll wear the helmet. And it was to preserve that flexibility, that personal decision, that we were really established. And so it was a bit more principle than it was practical experience, because people were wearing them. But they knew by then, the government knew, that the level of voluntary compliance was so great that they'd probably get away with that. And so far they have. The reality, which we mustn't forget to mention, is that the law didn't make the slightest difference to fatality rates. The number of people that will say, well, look at all the lives that have been saved. Well, show me them then. It's absolute rubbish, because most of the people, like me, for example, I've never been into speed, who would be the people who would most like to take their helmet off, and not the kind of people that are the big problem when it comes to fatalities. You're far more likely to find, and I think experience will bear this out, that the people that really want to go fast, people that pick up their whole riding style and attitude from the racetrack, also pick up the clothing styles from the racetrack and the protocols. And so I always felt a resentment that culture, the whole racing culture, which I've got nothing against, but it isn't my interpretation of riding, that they are forcing me, that culture is forcing me, into a protocol I don't want for reasons that are less applicable to me than they would be to others. And when people say, oh, well, look at the guys on the track, look at all the gear that they wear, I should hope they do, because the chances of them coming off are extremely high and frequently at high speeds. But then again, they don't hit anything, because that's what a racetrack's all about. But when you're just pottering around at 50 miles an hour, then it sounds blasé, so you don't need to wear all the gear. It's not as critical. Yeah.
So going back to MAG's history, MAG was formed to campaign to stop this legislation coming into place.
Well,
Obviously,
we're retrospective, really. It had come in. We were formed.
So the actual formation of MAG came after the legislation.
Immediately.
So you wouldn't say that MAG failed because MAG hadn't actually been created by the time of the legislation.
No, we didn't exist.
A bit of a sleight of hand, possibly.
yeah.
But do you think that the campaigning that MAG has done, at the time on the helmet issue, do you think that has been a total waste of time, or has it achieved anything for motorcycling?
I think it sent a very powerful signal to politicians that they would never have occurred. It would never have occurred to them before that there was a political lobby representing motorcycling that they had to consider. So, with all the other similar laws, the laws or suggestions of protocols which they would like to have made laws, which affects your safety but nobody else's. Clothing, for example, abrasion-resistant clothing. That doesn't protect anybody but you if you come off. And I know there are lots of people, and there have been politicians who said, well, we should make them all wear leathers or very high resistance clothing. Well, I don't want to have a checklist that I go through, trousers, jacket, gloves, all this care, back protectors, knee protectors, and all this stuff. You can make a case for wearing all that stuff. Of course you can, but you can make a case for saying you can only have 1 pint of beer a day. You can make a case of saying, oh, you can only have that many calories a day. And goodness me, the whole human landscape would look a lot different if we did have such legislation, but it wouldn't be enforceable. The thing about the helmet law was it was easy to enforce because you're so conspicuously in breach of the law on a motorcycle if you're not wearing one. But if you were really talking absolutely objectively about saving the public purse, which is where that argument about compulsion rested, look at all the trouble you make for the health services. But you could make a much stronger case for limiting people's calories. If you look at the cost of the health service, heart disorders, cancers, diabetes alone, never a word about compulsion there. And I wouldn't support it. If somebody came down the pub and said, oh, you've had your 1 pint for tonight, the Director General of Health says you can't have any more. Of course I'd be against that as well. But it's worth looking at the staggering contrast between the laxity exercised towards the whole population in respects of health and public burden in all those areas of personal physical care, and the way the great hammer came down on bikers. Why? Because we're conspicuous, and because in those days certainly we were seen as outsiders, outcasts almost. Much less so today. The spectrum of people who ride motorcycles is far broader. But the sense that you're always a bit of a nutter if you ride on 2 wheels will probably never die. And therefore the expectation that you've got to correspond to a set of society's requirements is massively out of proportion to the reality.
So for people outside of MAG, they possibly look at MAG and think, oh yeah, it's a one issue lobby group, that's all they care about. But for somebody on the outside who doesn't know about MAG, what else do you think MAG has achieved over the last 50 years?
I think the blocking of potential future legislation, which our resistance over all these years, I think it's helped that to not many of those potential laws to not come in. We've had some very significant wins which have been associated with proposals like the power limit. In the early 90s, for example, it was proposed that there should be a limit on the power of motorcycle engines, because the simple assumption that people make is there are still too many deaths on motorcycles. They're so incredibly fast, so ludicrously powerful. We've got to limit it, and that will bring down the number of deaths, without ever analysing what causes motorcycle accidents and deaths. And the result, I think you will find, in a very high proportion, is either driver error by others or rider error. You know, bikers often have accidents because they're pushing themselves to the limits, and not very, very seldom are they using all of the power of the highest powered bikes or anywhere near the top speeds. It's completely irrelevant. It's about the skills, and it's about self-control more than anything. I'm not a skilled rider, but I ride within my limitations. Clint Eastwood says in Dirty Harry, man's got to know his limitations. And that's most important. But ego often overrides that common sense, and you think, no, I can ride like Barry Sheen. You can't. Hardly anybody can.
Yeah, again, from a sort of like a lobbying perspective, we do find that an awful lot of the things that come up in terms of legislation or potential legislation is largely tied to this theory that we've got to make motorcycling safer. So it is largely about road safety. I think leg protectors was another issue that we faced. Was it back in the early
late
90s,
80s,
late 80s, early 90s, that sort of period?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how many people these days are even aware that was potentially a thing.
Probably
But
not.
We could have all been by now riding motorcycles with mandatory leg protection.
Yeah. You see, what had been observed is that the typical bad motorcycle accident where you break a leg is where a car pulls out of a turning, the bike hits it, and the bike folds against the car, trapping the rider's leg and breaking it. So they looked at ways of creating a space between the car and the motorcycle to prevent those broken leg injuries. And they came up with the idea of constructing strong structures on the sides of the bike that would preserve that safe space. And if you were just looking at it from a totally unemotional, detached and pragmatic viewpoint, it might seem like a sensible thing. First of all, it meant that now politicians were designing motorcycles, and they didn't like that. And they were designing them with no respect to the sensitivities, the aesthetics, the sense of personal involvement with the motorcycle, which is far more a feature of bikers and their bikes than it is motorists and their cars. You're able to do so much more customizing, and you design that bike so it fits you just like a pair of shoes or a suit. It's right for you. And so when politicians come in and start saying, oh, you need these structures on the side, the reaction of most people was go to hell, we're not having that. And furthermore, we did quite a bit of liaison there with the industry, motorcycle industry, and they conducted tests of equivalent status to the ones conducted by the government with crash test dummies, and found that when you had these devices connected to the bike, there was more chance that the rider would fly through a different trajectory as he came off the bike, and you're more likely you'd hit your head on the edge of the car roof than if you didn't have them. And that became quite a useful argument to use in the whole debate. And I think it reached a climax in '88 where we had a massive demonstration in Hyde Park. Hyde Park Corner was the venue for the speeches, and I got dressed up in a Michelin Man suit, you know, a big padded thing. Not comfortable to wear, it's not like a load of marshmallows, I can tell you. But what I was trying to illustrate was this is where we're going if we give in on this. This is where it ends. And the thin end of the wedge on, well, it started with helmets really, that was the thin end. But then if you say right now, we look at knee injuries, shoulder injuries, elbow injuries, and you end up with this fantastic padded thing that you've got to wear every time you go out on a motorcycle.
You effectively end up designing a car.
Exactly. You might as well.
Which clearly is not what we want to be driving around in.
No. Somebody sooner or later says, hang on, it's got no roof. I mean, leg protectors are kind of like roll bars, you might say, really, on two wheels. And yeah, sometimes you've got to accept reality and say, look, a motorcycle is a two-wheeled vehicle, and these people that ride them know more about them than you do. Listen to them. And so what Mag was saying was, look, just before you come up with another crackpot idea like this, and block Park Lane from end to end, which we did. Not deliberately, we just had so many people turn out, and we all followed the police instructions, got into the park, and we eventually cleared it. But it made BBC TV. And very shortly after that, there was backpedalling from the Department of Transport. The Minister, Peter Bottom, he said, "Oh, I never really wanted it to be compulsory." I thought, I kind of thought you did. But anyway, there was tremendous enthusiasm for having them fitted at the point of production of new bike. And the good thing about that for us was everybody hated them. And the whole motorcycle publishing crowd came on board in a way that they had not done in the past. That and the power issue were across the board. Nobody wanted these things coming in. And I think it woke a lot of people up to the fact that you need an organisation like MAG with professional employees who are lobbying the whole time, because you can put so many lunatic ideas like that out of the running before it ever gets anywhere near becoming law, before it even gets to the Commons for debate or anything like that, by having people rather like from Yes Minister, the A that says, "Excuse me, Prime Minister," you know. And most people will never know that. They'll say, "What do I get for my 30 quid a year?"
Yeah, and this is the problem, isn't it? When an awful lot of the work that MAG is doing is about stopping something from happening.
Yeah.
That effectively means that nobody sees the work that you've done.
That's right.
But, nothing has happened.
Yeah,
It's very difficult that you prove that you actually created nothing. Proving the negative is somewhat difficult.
Yeah. But nothing can be great.
And again, I mean, you touched on earlier about tampering. Anti-tampering is something that's come up in the headlines again, 18 months ago. But again, this is not something new. It's something that keeps on coming back. So these ideas are ingrained in the minds of the policymakers as, we haven't got it this time, but let's revisit that idea we had 20 years ago about anti-tampering. Stop modifying the exhaust, and that will solve all the problems and make it go away.
That's right. They always the trouble with legislators is they want legislative solutions to everything, when what you more commonly need is common sense. And when all the whole anti-tampering really began in the 70s, was at the time when loads of people were building chops that were frankly horrific. I built one of the worst, and I rode it to Israel. And one way you can have an adventure is just to be really badly prepared, very badly equipped, and set off on a motorcycle so ridiculous a clown wouldn't ride it into a circus tent. It was terrible. But why didn't I crash once? People, when they get on a vehicle of any kind that clearly does not have the handling capabilities of something much better, instantly slow down, because you can't do anything else. The thing was a complete piece of junk. But the point that I'm labouring here is, it's not necessarily the vehicle, even if it is unsafe, that leads to more accidents. It's the mindset. And it's just as you must ride within your capabilities. You must ride within the capabilities of the motorcycle. You do adjust to what you're riding or what you're driving. And that's something which road safety experts should take on board. We've got a guy that writes for our magazine, Kevin Williams. Very, very good, 30 years or more in the training world. And he gets all of this. He doesn't buy into any of the gimmicks. High visibility clothing, got to wear protective gear with back pads and elbow pads and all that stuff. And he gets it, that road safety is in your head. And it's in the head, as much the head of the rider for us as it is any other road user. You've got to take that responsibility. You've got to be responsible. Don't look to gimmicks and secondary devices which might minimise the consequences of an accident. Don't have the accident.
So prevention is better than cure, isn't it? It's, over the last 50 years, motorcycling, you can't deny it's changed, but certainly when you look at the statistics, it's fair to say that it has declined, certainly since the early 2000s. There was a rapid increase in the 90s, went through to about 2005, and then since then it just seems that motorcycling has been gradually declining. Why do you think that is?
So some things are either seen as cool or not cool. When I got into bikes, it was the coolest thing imaginable. And I think for some reason it's not appealing so much to the millennial generation as it did to us. I think there was almost like a post-war boys' own gripping yarns kind of appeal. You know, the same sort of thing that might propel people to join the army and go to get involved in daring do. And I think we've lost that in the computer age, where so many youngsters have got their faces stuffed in computer screens all day long, and it's changing mental attitudes. I think that's a big part of it.
Do you think there's any more barriers to entry these days? I'm thinking specifically about the testing regime.
Yeah.
If you look back to, you know, even as recent as when I first started, the process from then to now of how you actually go about getting a full license to ride a motorcycle has changed, you know, beyond recognition.
Oh, absolutely.
Do you think that's possibly something that is effectively putting people off from even making that first step into motorcycling?
I think it is, and it's expensive too to go through all of those stages. And I took my test in '74, having had bikes for 5 years. I had sidecar outfits, and then I got onto a solo, and I just had to ride around the block. You know, the most basic test that anybody over about 60 odd will tell you was how they did it. And so you could actually lose the examiner. I did, because I only took 2 right turns, and then I forgot the third one. And I lost him about a quarter of an hour before I got back. And he was on the point of going home, but he stuck around. And he said, all right, well, you haven't crashed in the meantime, so that's good. You're back here. Now we'll do the emergency stop. And that was it.
Yeah.
Oh, what a difference between now. I mean, I tried to do the slalom thing where you go between shapes, and then you got to brake in this quite short distance after. I tried to do it on a Harley, admittedly, with a load of camping gear on it. I couldn't do it. I couldn't get up to the speed necessary in order to brake in time, because I thought, I'll go through that fence. And I was very critical of the test then, because I thought, this is teaching people to perform circus tricks. And that's not what it's about. I think people should be tested on their recognition of hazards, and this is what Kevin Williams says all the time, and it's what got me through the years as a courier. Anticipate everything that can go wrong. Imagine that it will, because it will sooner or later, and then be ready for it.
What would be your take on something like autonomous vehicles? I mean, obviously there's a big push these days. Well, let's take the human element out of it, because we can't solve that. And let's have all these machines effectively drive themselves. I've seen an autonomous BMW GS riding around a car park, which you think, what's that for? You know, who's going to buy that? The joke I always use is that the photographer managed to get a picture of the first autonomous bike and the entire market for it at the same time, because there was nobody else in the picture.
It's right.
So it's like, why would we want that? So from a motorcycling perspective, I can't see autonomy catching on, but obviously it then puts us as riders in an environment with these autonomous vehicles. Do you think that's a good or bad thing?
Yeah, I don't like it. I mean, who knows? They might develop it to such a degree that there would be fewer accidents. I can't say, I'm not an expert, on that. I can't say how far that technology would go. As far as motorcycles are concerned, but it completely negates the whole point of a motorcycle, doesn't it? Because it's not about transport, not to me and not to many people. It's largely about enjoyment. It can be convenience. I mean, I made a living on bikes for 5 years, and it can be just getting somewhere. I didn't have a car till I was 61. But autonomy, whatever man makes will sooner or later go wrong. Everything. The question is whether it will go wrong more often than people go wrong. But there's something deeply suspicious about it I don't like. And I'm sure there will be horrific accidents where a big heavy car suddenly starts travelling at high speed and just crashes into everything in sight. It's like something out of a horror movie. And I don't think I'd ever feel comfortable knowing there isn't a human behind something. But then I feel a little bit that way about the whole AI. The genie is out of the bottle, so it may happen. I'm not comfortable about it. I think they're already trialling some cars on the roads of Britain now, certainly in America.
The latest news is that I think from next year, autonomous vehicles are going to be trialled on motorways in the UK, which I'd always thought was interesting, because there's never been any real sort of discussion with motorcyclists about how they feel about it.
No.
These things are going to be trialled on motorways, and yet motorcyclists, the only vulnerable road user group that uses a motorway, haven't been asked their opinion. What's that all about?
No, but we've given them some opinions.
We certainly do. Yes, we're not shy in coming forward.
No. Sometimes it's not the best thing to wait to be asked, and that's kind of what MAG is. We look ahead all the time, and we anticipate problems like this. And we provide our opinion whether it's wanted or not, but I think that's very valuable. Yeah, I don't like it.
You mentioned about driving in London. Last month you were back in Trafalgar Square at the anti-ULEZ protests, making a speech there. What's your take on all this sort of ultra-low emission zones, clean air zones? Where do you think motorcycling fits into all that?
Ultimately, science will provide the resolution of all those problems. I've absolutely no doubt about it. The question will be at what cost. The extension of the ultra-low emission zone across the whole of London, I think, is premature. My feeling from what I've read on the subject is that Sadiq Khan, the mayor, is prioritising ideology above pragmatism. And there is a downside to many people who have vehicles that don't conform. There's no point in saying that we shouldn't have clean air. Everybody wants clean air. But there is a point at which the expectation to change everything overnight becomes unrealistic, and you create victims that didn't exist before. And you will have people who just cannot afford a modern vehicle that complies. They've got to get to work. And public transport is not always the answer. If you live and you're not very well off, which actually is the majority of people in London, you live out on the edge and then you're coming in, but the zone is going to cover almost all of London now, isn't that what you might call London? And you might be a shift worker and you come in before midnight and you leave after midnight. It's £12.50 a day. It's astronomically expensive. And you might be coming on in an old Honda 90, which doesn't meet the regulations, but does 150 to the gallon or something fantastic.
It's strange the way these sort of campaigns go. I mean, obviously with ULEZ, MAG was up front right from the get-go that we were opposed to charging for motorcycles. Obviously, I don't want to go into the London-centric argument, but what happens in London generally gets replicated around the country. And so, clean air zones, propagated from London's ULEZ. But the first one outside of London that was going to introduce a charge for motorcycles was Birmingham, and we actually managed to defeat it there. We actually made the argument, and it was accepted, and they backed down. So for Birmingham, any motorcycle of any age can go in without a charge, whereas a car, you've got to pay, I think it's £8 for Birmingham. Why do you think London has been so resolute in not backing down on charging motorcycles at all, and certainly on charging motorcycles the same amount as they charge a car?
Yeah, I mean, it might boil down to sensitivities around the image of motorcycling. I've got nothing against the mayor personally, but I get the feeling he just doesn't like motorcycles. And if there is some kind of cultural objection to motorcycling, which still lingers in some people's minds, you sort of set off with the mindset that you're not going to cut any slack to those people on that you see as a bit kind of your being or whatever, I don't suppose we'll ever completely lose that. I don't find it much these days, but occasionally, and I think in this case possibly because the ideological zeal of there will be no exceptions to this, we're not going to recognise the fact that motorcycles are vehicles, that they can percolate through the traffic, that they've got all the advantages that we know about, and that they are part of the solution. Because if you help reduce traffic congestion, you reduce pollution. You've got all those vehicles, and they're all putting out something, unless they're electric, I suppose, something into the atmosphere. So if you can cut that down, and motorcycles help us do that simply by not being cars. Every motorcycle that is on the road is a car that's not on the road. And
Yeah, I think, I mean, certainly from my perspective, dealing with the intricacies of local transport plans and things like that, I think that there is this sense that although we've got all the right answers, we tick all the right boxes, there's still something that causes this resistance. Some of it is obviously vocalised as it's the safety issue, but I think it's more than just that. And like I said, I think even though it may not be stated openly, it's there as an undercurrent. There is this general feeling that motorcycling is it's a little bit dangerous. It's a little bit dirty. It's not something that fits in our nice new clean fancy world.
Yeah, I think that's true, and it's quite it's built into people's psyche that you're a bit mad if you ride a motorcycle. And I think a lot of bikers, myself included, like that. We might argue against it or object to the prejudice that may arise out of it, but at the same time, there's a little bit of the Wild West frontier about motorcycles, and that you will do something which others perceive as dangerous, or they certainly perceive it as being more dangerous than it really is, but they'll say, oh no, I could never do that. Well, I like that. And you've got to be honest about who you are and what you think and why you think those things. But similarly, conversely, those who are in power and think they're all a bit nuts, those guys, should not allow that sentiment. First, they should recognise that sentiment, and they should not allow it to affect pragmatic judgments. And there's part of Mag's job in enabling people to see that you're not going to get everybody on a motorcycle, but if you get people to use motorcycles some of the time, maybe in the good weather, for example, the commuting people in particular, then we are part of the solution. God, we've tried to hammer that message home for 20 or 30 years at least now. The solution to environmental problems, or part of the solution anyway, to congestion problems, and the two are related, and mobility problems and economic problems. We've got huge cities like London. To get people around at a reasonable speed and a reasonable cost is important. That's why you've got so many places in the Far East where their economies have grown spectacularly, and the motorcycle is the commonest form of travel. I think it is in Vietnam.
Yeah,
millions of them.
Yeah, we're at the 50-year mark with MAG. What do you think motorcycling is going to look in the next 50 years?
It's a great question, isn't it? Yeah. When I'm 121, this is going to be a big concern for me. And I've ridden up the Mall with a guy who was 100 on his 100th birthday, Len Vale Onslow from Birmingham, riding his own bike up to the palace. So that's 30 years away, so it's a good question. What was the question? What's it going to look like?
Yeah, what's motorcycling going to look like?
Yeah,
I think many people will say they've got serious concerns that motorcycling is going to continue. Do you think that's something that is a genuine concern or a realistic concern?
Yeah, well, it is. Because if people become so obsessed with safety that the whole concept of two wheels lies outside what they're prepared to accept, then of course that would totally do us. There is an optimistic streak in me, which is why I've been around this organisation for a while, that says we can always change minds. The big issue at the moment is the internal combustion engine, but I have no doubt that will be got around. I don't think batteries are the answer, so I'm not going to say that every bike's going to be electric. There are so many disadvantages to it. And so I think that technology will provide clean fuels which will sustain the longevity of the internal combustion engine. It's a very versatile instrument, and it has many advantages over battery-powered vehicles, and it's not as reliant on rare minerals like lithium and cobalt and so on. And so you can come at this from so many angles. The geopolitical angle is absolutely crucial. You see how the West is being blackmailed by Putin since the Ukraine war, and we've all got to rejig how we do things and save energy. But human beings are very versatile and will do that. You see Germany think, oh, we're dependent on Russian gas, and then what's happened? The Americans say, we'll get gas to you. And there's been giant tankers going into Germany, loaded up with kind of liquid gas, and because they're smart people and they adapt quickly, everybody adapts to problems like that. And in the same way, one day we'll run out of oil, so we've got to have something else. But I don't think batteries is going to turn out to be the way. I like to think it will be hydrogen. We're not there yet, obviously. But there are other ways of making fuel, and whether it's from vegetable material, from methane, all kinds of things. The versatile creature is the internal combustion engine. And from my point of view, and most riders, it gives you a degree of animal feedback, which we love. And we've got to convey that message to people that don't understand it. I was interviewing a guy from Petrol Revolt, which he said was a bit of a tongue-in-cheek kind of poke at it. And he says, technology will overcome this, because it's been his job for the last 30 years. Here's a problem, solve it. But you solve it with the internal combustion engine, and he's done it at the highest level. And that is the way we've got to go. We among many others will say, the science must be given the funding and the opportunity, and the politicians must give the opportunity to the manufacturers and to technology to prove that there's more than one way to skin a cat. We're the greatest of respect to cat owners.
Yeah, and as you say, I think this is part of the problem in terms of obviously the current sort of legislative direction in terms of the internal combustion engine is that's dead. It's past its sell-by date. The only option that we're really considering with any degree of seriousness is battery electric. Yeah. And that seems like such a narrow-minded way of looking at it.
It is, yeah.
And let's face it, we don't want politicians designing motorcycles. Yeah. That's not their skill set.
No, exactly.
We've got people who can design motorcycles. They can do it extremely well. Yeah. You set them a challenge and they will design the motorcycle that fits the bill. But unfortunately, the government legislation seems to be dead set on tying their hands behind the back and saying, you can come up with as many ideas as you like, but the only one that we're going to accept is that one.
Yeah. So our message to them has got to be, think outside the box, listen to people. There are more roads to the nirvana that's being pursued than you imagine, and we're going to show you what they are. And so MAG has to portray that message. If we're indifferent to the goal they're trying to achieve, we're lost politically. That's my view. Then we just get dismissed as a bunch of rowdy thugs for whom it's all about me, and to hell with everybody else and to hell with the world. Ain't going to work. Not in 100 years. We have to be responsible people saying, there's the goal, we recognise the goal, we're going to help you achieve it. Think outside the box, take notice of us, and do not cut off possibilities that can get you there quicker, get us all there quicker, than narrowing that range of possibilities.
Yeah.
It's mature political arguing, not petulant squawking. Yeah. That's what MAG has to be. You can't just be a bunch of rebels. You can have a little bit of a rebellious edge, but you've got to be part of the conversation, and you've got to be helping people see that you don't hold their ambitions in contempt.
So overall, you're an optimist. You think that there is a way that will be found through all this, and that MAG's role is effectively making sure that happens.
Yeah.
We can't just sit back and do nothing by any stretch of the imagination. But you're optimistic that there is a way through all this, and therefore it's worth joining MAG.
Absolutely. Yeah. 100%. Nailed it.
I'm good like that. You'd almost think that I was paid to do this, wouldn't you?
Fancy getting a job like that.
Yeah. Okay. So, is there anything else that you want to say? We're hoping that we'll have thousands of people listening to this podcast. Is there a parting message that you want to give to people?
Well, it's join MAG, obviously, but they'd expect that. It's not like it's a lot of money, really. 30 quid a year. What a fantastic magazine they get as well, don't they?
Yeah, I'd say the editor of that, I don't know how he does such a job. It's amazing.
I mean, when you see magazines, like the fashion magazines and that, you have to mount those people are paid to run rubbish like that. They're like adverts from one end to the other. You look at it, where's the content? Where's the mirth? Where's the humour? Where's the information? Where's anything? Call them editors. Bunch of comedians, Look at the amount of wit and wisdom and skill and art that goes into Open Road. What a great title. Open Road. That summarises what MAG is. Keep the road open. Keep the excitement and the opportunities and the freedom open. That's what MAG is all about. So if you're listening to this and you're not on them, just do it. Just go online and do it now.
Thank you, Ian, for your time, and I'm sure we'll introduce you back again for further editions of the podcast. But our goal here is to get a broad range of voices from within MAG, as many people state the same argument from a slightly different position. Because I mean, this is one thing I noticed at a MAG regional meeting I was at last night, is that when you get a bunch of bikers together, they all agree. They all come at it from a slightly different position, a slightly different perspective, but the fundamentals, everybody agrees. We're all bikers.
Exactly. Hey ho, good man.
Cheers.